Really appreciate everyone being here again. I'm working off 2 screens here, so let's see if I can keep my coordination. This is a live meeting. We are being recorded. There will be several moments in the presentation when I will stop and basically just poll the crowd, have a little bit of a discussion. I do want to hear from you all tonight. That's my goal. I also have material to get through to make sure that everyone understands what we're doing in this process. And I do believe we'll be able to wrap up before 6 o'clock. So, overview of the agenda here. We did welcome introductions. I'm going to talk a little bit about what hazard mitigation planning is. For those of you that were at that committee meeting, the kickoff meeting, it'll be a bit redundant. I'll try to move through as quickly as possible, but I want to make sure we're all working with the same understanding. We'll talk about the natural hazards in South Kingstown that we're looking at in this plan. We will talk about project goals and community assets in the town and how that plays into the overall risk assessment process. Talk about where we are in the process and then where we're going, next steps, and a discussion at the end. So starting with hazard mitigation planning, what are we talking about here? FEMA defines hazard mitigation planning as any sustained action taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risk to people and property from natural hazards. So examples of that could be limiting development in high-risk areas, retrofitting structures to protect them from floods or high winds, making major infrastructural investments and drainage improvements like the picture shown here, other flood control projects in areas of localized flooding, community wildfire protection planning. These are all examples of what you might find in a mitigation action plan. Benefits of the planning and the resulting plan, helping prepare for and mitigate the effects of natural hazards is sort of the straightforward one. Supporting preparedness planning and also building on resilience planning for climate change. The plan itself is going to serve as a guide for decision makers as they commit resources to minimize these impacts of natural hazards. And then, of course, to the point made earlier, having this plan active and in place and adopted qualifies the town for certain pre-disaster mitigation grants from FEMA that otherwise, without a plan, without an active and live plan, you are not eligible for those grants. And there's a lot of money in that bucket. So for South Kingstown, specifically in your 2019 plan, you laid out a vision for why you're doing this process. And the 2 sort of sentences that were phrased as both a mission statement and an overall vision are to prepare for the impacts of natural hazards and climate change, and then to enhance the community's quality of life, protecting property, citizens, and preserving the natural resources of South Kingstown. So we're carrying that forward here. I do want to take a minute to talk about climate change. There's no greater systemic threat to the health of our natural systems and our human populations than climate change, both in Rhode Island and globally. It's a fundamental factor as a planner. I view almost everything that I do through the lens of climate impacts, but nowhere more than in natural hazard mitigation planning. It's ubiquitous. It shows up in every aspect of my work. In our region, climate change is manifested mostly by precipitation, extreme weather events, sea level rise, and extreme heat. So, and actually, I need to start adding to that fire risk with the droughts and what we've seen here more recently. So most of our infrastructure, as you all know, is built for past conditions. Science has come a long way. We now know more of what to expect in the future, and so planning to mitigate natural hazards really requires a forward-looking approach. This hazard mitigation plan update is an opportunity to continue the work that the town has already done in the climate change realm and climate adaptation realm, just advancing the conversation and continuing to build resilience around climate change in South Kingstown. So the process itself, this is on the left hand of the slide. I'm showing the key elements of the planning process, beginning with the risk assessment, and then on the right side of the screen, you're looking at an outline of the actual plan. It's almost identical to the plan that you did in 2019. The changes if there are any, will be both for the data updates, but also we try to keep aligned with the state plans. As the state plans change every 5 years, those are sort of the guiding plans for local jurisdictions. They don't need to be exact, but those are, they sort of redirect certain policies, and so there are some tweaks in just the organization that we like to follow. The risk assessment is where the heaviest lifting of data and information gathering occurs. That's where we are right now. We're trying to assess the who, what, where. So who, what, where in town are most at risk during a natural hazard event. What's the current state of protections in town in terms of your capabilities for risk mitigation? And then we also evaluate vulnerability and we evaluate capability. Outreach and coordination are a critical part of this process. FEMA continues to expand their scrutiny of what participation means through these processes. I've been doing mitigation plans for at least 15 years, and they look a lot different now, in a good way. As a planner, I can say that in a good way. There's much more of a focus on equity, much more of a focus on vulnerable populations. Municipalities are required to actively participate, and that is both conducting outreach, so sharing information about the planning process, but also facilitating participation, making it possible and in fact probable to get input and participation in the planning process by both internal and external stakeholders. We, as the consultant, rely heavily on our local partners and committee members to make that happen. It's just not, you don't get community members by having someone who they don't know come out and say, please come join us. You know, so the committee is a huge part of making that happen. FEMA will require the plan to show exactly how the local committee and the local community directly engaged with certain subsets of the population. So that includes businesses, academia, other private and nonprofit interests, and how they were contacted, how they were involved in the planning process, how their ideas were shared and incorporated into the ultimate plan. So in order to do all of that and make sure we're hitting the mark, the town developed a robust mitigation planning participation strategy. This is part of why we're here tonight. We've got the Hazard Mitigation and Planning Committee, which is serving as an advisory board and a liaison to the community. We've got this public meeting. We'll have another public presentation when we have a draft plan. We have a public website for the plan. I know Jamie and Jay sent out several flyers, and we had we have a public survey that's live that has been advertised for the last several weeks. When I checked on Monday, we had 6 responses. I'm hoping we can get that like multiplied by a factor of 15 in the next couple of weeks. The 2011 survey had 150 responses. So this survey that we're doing is really, it's a sort of taking a snapshot of what the answers look like 5 years later. We're keeping track of the public perception on risk in town, seeing what has changed. And then also the planning department, who's the local lead for this job, is continuing to send out information to department heads, and you all received an email about this meeting. So that's part of the sort of chain of command in the public outreach. We think of you all also as liaisons to your constituents as well. Excuse me. So with the support of the committee, we will undertake this mitigation outreach effort and ultimately produce a draft plan that will be available for public review for a month. And we'll keep advertising for that, again, to get as much public input as we can. The survey, I said, is live now. The QR code on the screen will take you there. You can also get there by visiting the plan website. All right, so moving into natural hazards. In South Kingstown, so natural hazard, big picture, naturally occurring condition or event that can cause loss or damage to people, property, the environment, infrastructure, and the economy. So this is our first sort of break into discussion. As a committee at our first meeting, we had a pretty robust discussion about the natural hazards that were profiled in the 2019 plan, the natural hazards that are profiled in the state plan, which you are required to consider all of them as a jurisdiction doing your planning process, and what is relevant in South Kingstown. I just thought it would take a minute for folks who weren't part of that discussion to ask you all what natural hazards have impacted this town in the last 5 years.
Coastal erosion.
Great, okay. And any specific areas? Matunic, yep, okay. Anyone else? Okay.
Specifically, issues we've had?
Yeah, you know, what events, if you can remember specific.
We've had a number of rain events, usually when we exceed about 5.5 inches that cause flooding along the soil type.
Okay,
And then a number of hot spots that we have. Eastdale is one. Culver's
we'll get into those specific locations in a little bit.
So generally that's what it is. So with a specific rain event, I mean, it's difficult because it happens very fast and it can be gone within 5 or 6 hours.
Right.
But it's caused a lot of impact.
And you're saying that threshold is 5.5 inches over the course of 24 hours, or?
What I've seen is it's about 5 inches in a 4 to 5 hour period.
Okay,
That's generally what I've seen. And so it's a very flash type of thing.
yep,
We did have a series of storms last year, one on December 21st of 2023, and then January, beginning of January, we had 2 storms back to back, which were coastal events. So we have 2 types of events. The rain events affect the Saugatucket.
Yep.
The coastal events affect the Tunic, the Charleston Beach Road as well, which is a road that we own that actually goes from the town of Charleston to get to. It's a gravel road. We lost about 800 feet last year.
wow.
Is the natural hazards, are you including flooding and wind in?
Yes, wind is considered one of our hazards, yes.
So those are coastal, and people are really happy with that December storm.
Yep.
About much of the dune.
Mm-hmm.
January storms, they're somewhat unimpeded. And that's when it reached the road, it reached Tunic was underwater. That was as significant as we normally see.
Okay,
We have seen worse, but that was pretty bad.
all right. Any other stories folks want to share about hazards in the last 5 years?
I think the biggest one was that storm from last, the 2 storms from last winter.
Yep.
Definitely.
Okay,
I mean, and that was really swimming with water suction storm from the shore resources. And our family had a house down there from since 1950. And it was the first time that I saw water. We never had it really well enough. And that was the disease for the town. And that was the first time from 1950.
wow.
And I know that that would be, you know, the same thing for the Tunic and probably the mountains.
Right, right.
It's stunning.
Some of it qualifies as a hazard event, but there's been a lot of new diseases introduced into our forest. There's Usum disease and Aerodactyl, and then a number of years ago we had a sunshmock infestation followed by extinction drought period. So there's a lot of dead and dying mature forests throughout the community.
Mm-hmm.
Ash is the biggest I think we've had so
And
far.
the
Could be worse in the future, but
beach roads are getting into that.
beach is a big deal, but the ash has been, we've been actively addressing ash trees, any tree along the roads.
Yep.
But we've been working with National Grid as well to prevent any of the wires that's up there.
Mm-hmm.
But ash has been the big one, and we're gonna see certain others, but ash has been a real problem.
But
In
it's
fact, National Grid
because
told
of
us,
fires, in addition to them dropping on people's heads.
Yes,
Inconsistent with the fire, they had an expectation of property.
right. And in some instances, the invasive species itself could be the hazard. In the case that you're discussing, I think the hazard is the wildfire risk. We're talking about increase in wildfire risk due to these infestations. I think you can come at it from both angles, but I think that the greater risk is in the future, the increase of this very flammable fuel.
When we address the road, we address the town road.
Right,
That doesn't mean these forests aren't full of these dead and dying trees. If you walk through the forest, you can see all sections of the forest.
that's right. 10 years ago, this discussion would have been about power outages. It would have been about taking trees down next to power lines because they're dangerous, because they're dying. And now we're also talking a lot more about the actual forestry component.
That's the same thing with the amount of invasive plants that are definitely not what we grow in long state stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Or say you go North Road, you've got two palm hashtag invasive weed that grows up there. I forget what it's called, I took away the Chapman tails. That's, all that dies down and fills up those spaces with less area in order to flood. You need to get them to that long to spread this stuff out. As soon as those start filling up and dying, there's nowhere else for more to go.
Right, they're taking up that valuable flood storage space. This is great. Thank you. Any other thoughts on this? Okay, so moving on, we, aside from hearing from you all and gathering survey information, one indication of the hazards, how things are changing and what's occurred in the last 5 years for us in our research is looking at the presidential disaster declaration events. These are events of significant magnitude, obviously, or impact, and this is a table just showing the disaster declarations for the entire state since 2019. We also look at the hazards profiled in the state plan. So those are our two guiding forces. And obviously not all of these will have necessarily impacted South Kingstown, but it's where we start. And then I mentioned there were 6 responses to the survey as of Monday. This is showing the 5 that answered this question. Have you ever experienced or impacted by a natural disaster in South Kingstown? If so, what type? So all of these, I'm really just showing slides to validate that the hazards of high concern in the 2019 plan are still showing up as some of our major concerns now. And I think some of the additions that we're talking about with the wildfire and the invasive species and how they're impacting, it's almost a secondary hazard to the existing flood risk when you're talking about filling in the wetlands. It's also the invasive species, how that hazard itself is impacting the wildfire risk. So this is all getting very intertwined, but we clearly have issues with flooding and severe storms and coastal storms in this town. The Mitigation Planning Committee, when we met a month ago-ish, we did review all of this information. We reviewed the 2019 plan, the 2024 Rhode Island plan, the existing declarations. We reviewed the hazards of concern and the plan organization, and we left that meeting with a list of the hazards that would be profiled in the 2025 plan. That's what you're looking at here. I mentioned that there will be some reorganizations, categorizations based on the state plan and for the benefit really of the overall organization of your municipal plan. And one example, the thing I can think of right now is the flood profile, which is a subchapter in the hazard profiles chapter. We describe what flooding is, what it looks like, what different types of flooding. Then we get into certain vulnerabilities and really technical detail. We do some mapping. In the 2019 plan, you had a separate chapter for each type of flooding. There just ends up being redundancy. It's just more pages. So here we are following the state plan format to say flooding is the hazard. What can that look like? It can be coastal flooding. It can be stormwater flooding. It can be flooding due to ground saturation. It can be riverine flooding. They're all getting the exact same bandwidth, same content, different organization. And it will reduce some redundancy. So next question is, where do these hazards occur? This is a photo that I grabbed down from Storm Tools, from a storm reporter from January 10th, 2024. So this might have been one of those events.
That was January? That's
January 10th.
That's one of the, yeah, so then we got another one on the 12th. But that's one of the,
This is Middlebridge Road. Okay.
That happens when we have
Yep.
and on high tide. And we get a real surge, that's New Bridge area, that's a real surge that we normally see in that spot.
Yeah, so the Storm Tools reporter reports are extremely valuable. It's not something that we have available in other states. I think it's been a URI product, and it's been super helpful for planners. As part of this hazard mitigation planning process, I'm usually asking people, and I will ask you, please send me photos, send me videos, send me your stories of when this happened at your house, on your street. All of that is really valuable for the plan because it helps us tell a story, and not just keep it at the data level. Pictures say 1,000 words, and so it's helpful if you do have any photos of vulnerabilities around town or hazards and how they've impacted the town. Please do share them. My email will be on the last slide, or you could send them to Jamie or Jay. So anyways, the purpose of this slide is just to say, in addition to your public input, we're using other data sources. So the image to the right there is a map from the 2019 plan showing the coastal flood hazard. We look at FEMA data, we look at Storm Tools, we look at RIGIS. Many of the natural hazards we look at in this plan, from that last slide, you saw they're regional in distribution. We can't really put them on a map in a way that's valuable. We're not going to know where a tornado might land down. We're not going to know where you're going to have more hail damage than otherwise when a thunderstorm rolls through. Those things just don't have. We don't have a way to say it's going to be worse here than it is here. So we don't map those, but the 2019 plan included extensive mapping of sea level rise and roadway vulnerability, as well as HAZUS, which is a FEMA mapping program for hurricane scenarios. Those analyses are all still valid. The data hasn't changed there, so we're not updating those maps, but the FEMA flood maps, the regulatory flood maps, have changed. Your maps were updated in 2022, I believe, 2023. So we are updating, we're remapping the flood hazards based on the FEMA regulatory floodplain for this plan update. Moving right along here, project goals and community assets. So back to that process diagram I showed earlier, FEMA has you establish goals after you do the risk assessment. I don't love that. I think the goals discussion has to be an earlier part of the process, and so this is something we discuss as a committee. For a hazard mitigation plan update, it's unlikely you're going to change a lot about your goals. In this case, FEMA has changed their planning guidelines in 2022-23. So your 2019 plan now doesn't meet all of the requirements of FEMA's hazard mitigation planning guidelines. And the big one, and the reason I'm bringing this up now, is because one of those changes was about looking at high hazard potential dams. All plans now have to include certain depth of discussion about high hazard potential dams that they weren't required to include before. That includes adding a mitigation goal that speaks specifically to these HHPDs, and also describing how local government worked with local dam owners or the state dam safety agency to evaluate risks and vulnerabilities from these high hazard potential dams. Part of our planning process is to help the town coordinate some of that outreach. We communicate directly with the state, and then we also help to navigate coordination with any private dam owners, which is tricky. In South Kingstown, you guys own some of your high hazard potential dams? Yeah. I think you have 4 high hazard and 3 significant.
Could be, yeah, something like that. And then there are other high hazards though that we don't own.
Right.
And,
one. I think just one.
Is it one, did you say?
Maybe.
There's not a lot of volume use there, but the trick is there are 2 or 3 that are,
Mm-hmm.
it hasn't been determined.
Right.
I believe we have plans for everything.
We do. I think we are in pretty good shape with the plans.
We have plans for almost everything. There's one on Hopkins, I don't know that there was anything for that.
So the process, what we need to do during the planning process is essentially a good faith effort to reach out and do some brainstorming. If we don't know who owns it, how can we find that out? And then we'll translate that into the mitigation strategy. Really, we'll get as much done as we can through the planning process, then we'll say, these are our steps to advance this, so that we can make sure that we're doing the best to make sure that these infrastructure are.
But we're not gonna end up at a point where we're gonna be looking to enforce on private.
No, that's,
I always fear that because, you know, the ownership trail is tough to track and they're expensive.
right, and the point, FEMA's not trying to place a mark on anyone to say, we got you. We're gonna use this planning process to make sure that we know who's responsible, and we're gonna make sure that person does. What they wanna do is they wanna facilitate conversation and coordination between agencies. I mean, most of the private dam owners that own these dams, they aren't part of the discussion because they don't have the financing to do anything about it. And so where FEMA comes in to say, well, states have funding, federal government has funding, if we don't draw people out of the woodwork, we can't even bring this public-private partnership potential together. So that's the idea.
I just fear that, it's difficult to get some of these private owners to do what they really obligated to do.
Yes.
And we're ultimately gonna drain them all. Fish go wherever they want.
Yep. So we can talk more about this, but, you know, I think, was it Richmond? No, this was in Massachusetts. We did a plan recently where we facilitated a conversation between the town planning director and town DPW super and an owner of one of the, it was actually an owner's representative, is probably a lawyer, for a dam that needed to update their documents. And they were frank, and they said, we haven't updated the AP because we are not a solvent company. We don't have funds to do that. So we provided some information to them. The town's gonna check in with them annually. They're gonna talk with the state to see if the state can do anything for them. And that's, you know, that's a step in the right direction, because ultimately for the town, they want to see the dam repaired, because it's their obligation to protect their residents. Not their obligation to pay to have it fixed, but there are small improvements.
It's a scary thing.
Yeah.
And especially when we get some of these big storms, it's like, you know, you just watch them praying that nothing breaks. We do have plans to determine evacuation zones for everything,
Mm-hmm.
but we keep them on file, but yeah, you're right.
So all that to say, we have a new goal for this plan, which is to take measures to reduce vulnerabilities from high hazard potential dams. Looking at community assets, this is another big part of the risk assessment process. It's understanding what assets or community features are vulnerable to the hazards that we've identified, and also what assets or community features are critical to mitigating the impacts of those hazards. So as we deal with these events, you know, the first question is like, what buildings and services do we need to operate, to function, to do emergency management during an event, or just to provide for day-to-day living in town? Those are your hospitals, your grocery stores, probably your internet and cell service, your town hall, your fire and police department.
Is there a model for this critical infrastructure in hospitals?
A model?
Is there a model that you use for, say, scalable natural hazards, flooding levels?
Yeah.
What's lost at this level, this level?
So that's the HAZIS model, I think, that you're probably thinking about. The FEMA does have a model, but it's not scalable in the way that you're discussing. It's more of a algorithm to identify replacement cost for different storm events. What we do for this plan for the geographically specific hazards is really put these critical facilities, after we hear from the public and the committee, make sure we've got all of these assets. We put them on a map up against the flood hazard, layer. And so it's a surface level vulnerability analysis. We're not getting into that detail of you know, is this a 12-hour, 6-inch storm event? Is this we look at the 100-year versus the 500-year FEMA floodplain, but we're not doing detailed hydrologic or hydraulic analyses on it.
Okay, I'll represent URI.
Yeah.
Coastal hazard analysis model prediction system for that RI tank.
Right, yes.
Which does suspend points data for critical infrastructure consequence data.
And I'm familiar with Rhode Island Champ. I don't recall if it was out in advance of the 2019 plan, if that would have been incorporated. Okay. All right. Well, you know, something we'll take a look at. If there's a way that we can incorporate that without having to do too much additional analysis, we would be happy to do that. So the next question is what is sort of the human mitigative, human resilience, human asset side of this. So what types of events or community centers, also facilities, create and foster community resilience? These could be your town hall again, could be a community center, could be a certain community event that happens every year where there's a large gathering. It could be your schools, your libraries, senior centers. So these are all just part of what we're thinking of for these community assets. And they're all important for mitigation, they're all important for resilience. So this is, to the left, this is a map showing some of the community assets or critical facilities based on the 2019 plan and a sort of, we sent the list from the 2019 plan out to the Mitigation Planning Committee a month and a half ago or so and got a little bit of an update. Specifically, what we're seeing here are mostly built environment assets. We don't have, I don't think we have all of our wetlands and open space properties listed here, but the university municipal offices, municipal safety facilities, libraries, bridges, things like that. The photo to the right is by Peter Rentel's. It's a photo of Great Swamp. You probably know that. The Great Swamp in and of itself is a community asset, and so I put this on the slide to illustrate that we're not just talking about buildings, and we're not just talking about infrastructure. Natural features provide great value in hazard mitigation, and so that's part of what we're evaluating here as an asset and a community capability. In South Kingstown, wetlands comprise about 12% of the total land area, and then you've got almost 30% of town in some sort of conservation, which is fantastic. So this plan is going to look at vulnerabilities for a range of these critical assets, like the town's wetland system and emergency services facilities, and then these are going to be the early framework of the development of mitigation actions to reduce risk. If none of those features that we're talking about as community assets or critical facilities were vulnerable to natural hazards, we wouldn't have a lot of work to do. The plan, obviously, that's not the case, so we're identifying which assets and features are going to be at risk in several categories, and like I said, it's buildings, it's infrastructure, it's population, the environment, and critical facilities. So this is another one of these interludes. This is an example of the depth that we're going into these assets. In 2019, you had this list of all of these features, drainage systems, streets, infrastructure, that is susceptible to flooding. Given the time, we probably don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is part of the discussion we have with the planning committee. We will talk about this list and we'll say, all right, what's changed? Are these still vulnerable? Have you done any work in the last 5 years to mitigate the impacts at any of these specific locations? And if so, let's revise the plan. We're going to add that as a new capability, that you have a flood resilient intersection based on some work that was done. Or if not, these are still vulnerabilities and these are still gonna be subject of the mitigation action plan, as Jamie mentioned. You wanna make sure that any project that you wanna get done is in that mitigation action strategy, because that makes it eligible for funding. So, just as an illustration, one of the 6 survey respondents that I looked at on Monday had already mentioned Warden's Pond Road, and that was on the 2019 list. So I'm gonna venture a guess to say that that hasn't been fully mitigated at Warden's Pond Road.
What's Pond Road proximity to Woodland Pond?
Yeah. Yes, right, yes.
Well, we've not done any of that area.
Okay.
And there's really no more culvert there. I'm not sure that
Yeah, it was listed in the last plan, and then again, it came up in a survey response, so it'll be something we'll look at as a committee, and,
Warden's Pond seems discharged where it should.
okay. According to DEM, there are no designated environmental justice communities in South Kingstown, but there are other members of the community who are uniquely at risk to natural hazards, and we're gonna talk about that in the plan. Broadly speaking, the very young and the very old are particularly vulnerable to extreme weather. They're often relying on other people or public services for food or for transport or for just basic life necessities, even for information, making them more reliant on others for evacuations or for wellness checks or any services. Interestingly, in academic communities, a lot of off-campus residents from out of the area have a similar predicament, so they're also relying on others for services and even for information. They don't necessarily know where to go. They don't have a backup, plan in the area. Certainly those working under the poverty line or who are unemployed don't have the same means for things like evacuation or to improve their homes, maybe to build resiliency. So they'll be more vulnerable to certain impacts. And similarly, the homeless population, they're not gonna have means to evacuate or shelter without public assistance. And lastly, individuals with special needs are also at greater risk, and the facilities that serve them. So nursing homes, critical care facilities, certainly hospitals. Finally, in our risk assessment, we ask what tools we have currently in our toolbox at our disposal to reduce our exposure, to reduce our vulnerability, and ultimately to reduce impact and risk. In other words, like how do we lessen how bad it is when these hazards occur? Generally, capabilities for hazard mitigation planning fall into a couple categories. We talk about planning and regulatory, administrative and technical, financial, pretty straightforward, education and outreach. How well do we disseminate information to those who need it? How well are people able to access that information? And partnerships. How well are we accessing our public-private partnerships, our partnerships with between government and community organizations as liaisons to members of the public? Again, here, yep, question? Yeah.
Areas, and because the town is sole source aquifer for its drinking water, and with the increasing scenarios with drought, that qualify in terms of environmental hazard mitigation is to intentions of protecting lands of open space that could help address that issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it sounds like you're noting an existing capability that maybe needs some strengthening or expansion, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Definitely, it's all, that is very much relevant in this case. Again, in this process, we are looking at the capabilities listed in 2019. We're looking to see where have there been code updates, where has there been a change in staffing or a change in protection in valuable conservation areas or in wetlands, and then incorporating those into the new plan. So that is the bulk of the technical content here. Next steps, we're going to continue to gather survey results. Another plug, please do share with your constituents the link to the survey. Please ask your neighbors and your family members to participate. This is some of the most valuable information that we use as planners coming in. People's stories, they really give us the big picture. So we'll integrate that public feedback. We will be updating those community assets and facilities that I just talked about in coordination with the Hazard Mitigation Planning Committee. Our next committee meeting, folks will see a handful of worksheets. We'll have some homework. We'll make it as easy as possible to get that information from you all. But it's a lot of information. And then another big lift with the committee is going to be updating the status of the previously proposed mitigation actions and developing new actions, which interestingly, the developing new actions is not the hardest part, because at that point we've got all the information. We really understand where the needs are, where the vulnerabilities are, and what hasn't been addressed. But figuring out what happened with the 40 mitigation strategies proposed in 2019 is a pretty big lift. So this is sort of the breakdown. With all of these vulnerabilities I've discussed, the action list is categorized by these vulnerabilities, and the committee develops actions to address those vulnerabilities. So in 2019, the big ones were flood-prone drainage systems, critical municipal hazard response facilities, population, so mitigating impacts to human populations, and wastewater had a significant amount. And then a scattering of others here. This is what they look like in the plan. So again, this example of a 2019 action, each action is categorized, as I said, by their vulnerability, but also by mitigation type, alignment with the planning goals, the type, how it fits into sort of an emergency response framework. We go through a prioritization process with the committee once we have this updated list, and so each hazard will have each action, will have a priority assigned to it. And then there will be a narrative description about what the action is, and ideally some guidance on how steps to take to implement. FEMA is also requiring that each action be associated with a lead responsible party, whether that be a town department or a local nonprofit or a commission or something else. We need to show an estimated timeline for completion. We need to show an assessment of how the action will be funded. And this has been a big one in the last 2 years from FEMA Region 1. They no longer accept staff time as a description of how an action will be funded. And they no longer accept town, like the town will pay for this. They want to know what department's budget it's coming out of. They want to know what grant you're pursuing. And if it is going to be staff time or volunteer time, you need to say what staff under what department, and then I normally add that's out of the operation budget for, say, the planning department operation budget, rather than saying staff time. That's what they want to see. So they're really pushing specifics. And the flip side of that, I think, or the silver lining, you might say, from a planning perspective, is that it really makes us think critically about the actions we're putting in these plans, because if there's no way that they're going to get done because no one's going to own them, they might not have a place in this plan. That is not to say that you don't put a long shot project as an action because you don't have the funding yet. We can say, we don't have the funding yet, we are going to seek a FEMA grant, or we're going to seek a NOAA grant, or we really want this big project, but we don't know how to do it yet. We can put that in there and they'll accept it, but they're pushing communities to really think about how these things can get done. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say about that. So the 2025 action list will look very much like the 2019 action list, updated. You will see some new strategies. Of course, some strategies will be carried over. when we look at that 2019 list, we're gonna see a lot of things that haven't been totally completed yet, and that's fine, and we're gonna give an update on that, and what have been the challenges, and what do we need to overcome those challenges, how might we tweak the direction of the action so that it's more likely to be implemented in the next 5 years. Each action is gonna be written up with all of these supporting information categories to meet the FEMA requirements, and we will be doing this again with the committee, and in terms of developing new actions, the public input that we receive will feed into that decision-making process as well. So, with that, I wanted to open it up for general questions and comments. I really appreciate the discussion that you all have brought so far. It's a multifaceted sort of process. We bring a lot of information into this, and what most people see at the end is the list of actions, and that's fine, but these plans also contain a lot of information, and they can be really valuable for any community department going for grants in the next 5 years, having to do with anything about the environment and infrastructure and vulnerable communities. So we want to make sure that we get it right, because these can be a really valuable tool. So just to clarify, the part of the question is the grant system based on, which grant are you referring to? I can't speak to that. I think that, broadly speaking, whether it's a federal or a state grant, if it's focused on climate change, I don't think there needs to necessarily be a certain magnitude of impact to prove that there's a vulnerability and that there would be a project worth funding. I've worked with clients who are getting money for something as small as a culvert replacement, but showing that with their existing municipal budget and the way that things have been done forever, there's no way that they can replace this culvert that's failing in a way that would accommodate future events unless they had funding from the state or the federal government. So there's something like that. If you're thinking of like grants, some projects being more competitive than others, I think there might be a space for that. I'm not sure if I'm fully getting to.
I guess the baseline question is what is the strategy, basically, the mitigation strategy based on what we're doing,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I mean, I love that question, and that's really getting into the meat of these actions. And that in and of itself is a project that would require so much analysis to go through those feasibility, the feasibility of different approaches to that mitigation strategy, which is to reduce vulnerability of that area. Do you retreat? Do you do physical measures? This plan is not going to get into that level of detail, but what this plan can do, for instance, would be to say, we recommend an action to conduct a study about resilience alternatives for this area. And that study should look at X, Y, Z, and evaluate the feasibility of taking these various approaches. That's how an Army Corps feasibility study would be done. That's how really a flood risk reduction study would be done. So that's where you can get into the more detail, but thinking creatively about those types of projects during this process can be really valuable, because it sort of gets the wheels turning and it puts something on paper to say, this is really how we have to go about this. We can't just say this is how we're going to fix such a big problem, right? We need to dig deeper. Yep.
And we referenced the previous plan and referenced the specific items that we were looking to address. And they like to know that you're not just pulling things out of
Yeah, and FEMA requires it. FEMA requires
Monitoring grants required,
you to have mentioned it in your hazard mitigation plan. Now,
and you didn't.
loophole, you can update this plan whenever you want. You could meet as a committee every year to say, any new needs, anything we missed, if so, let's add it in as an addendum. That is totally valid, and if you then want to go and ask for a FEMA grant for it, you just show them those meeting minutes or the addendum that you made, and you're all set. Most communities don't do that, unfortunately. They don't meet annually. They don't meet until the next 5-year plan update is required. But I know state grants, at least in Massachusetts, that require. Yeah. They're pointing to the hazard mitigation plan to say, was this listed in your mitigation priorities? So.
It's not that you can't get the money without it. It's just saying it's just much easier if you have already thought about it.
For most, yes, but there are some that do require it.
That require it.
Yeah. Yep. Any other thoughts?
I'll just add, fiscal district commission, the final report is on that, where we got state grant to identify all the historic properties that are
Oh, that's great.
flooding
Okay.
and those historic properties have been identified. The end result is just to notify property owners that the property is at risk and sort of mitigate what might be coming.
That's fantastic. When could I get my eyes on that report so that we could incorporate it?
We can get it to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's great information. Because as I was telling you, we've got the layer, and we'll map it against the FEMA floodplain, but if it wasn't included in the sea level rise mapping in 2019, it wouldn't be captured in that same detail. Great. Yeah, I'm sure. Yes?
So typically, hazard mitigation tends to focus these plans on property and infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right? There are other components you mentioned, people
Mm-hmm.
and economy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Those tend to be light in these plans,
Yes.
because infrastructure is easy, right? Culvert needs to be upgraded, prevent coastal erosion, create communities, et cetera. But this comes to mind because as we build a new high school and we're talking about shelter, like what's a shelter mean, storm shelter definitions, like where do the people go when they can't, when the hazard isn't mitigated, right? Is the next hurricane Ian coming up the coast and it's Cat 5 and they're not going to get out of the way, who's the place to retreat to? The evacuation is to get people out of it and things like that. So I don't know what level that's addressed, like what are the routes to get people out that you just are not going to, because it's mitigated. The second thing is economy. So when the businesses get destroyed and the resiliency to come back, let's say you have the tax base impacted the businesses in Main Street. I tend to see that kind of light as well in these
Yeah.
plans, because it's a complicated issue. But it is an issue, because if you look at these communities that get devastated, one of the big pieces is if you look, just down south in the flooding, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I visited there a year before and that all happened, and that whole riverfront district is gone.
It's hard to even imagine what happened there. Yeah.
So that's a lot of economy. You can't resolve all that, but I just was wondering, are you addressing any of that in this plan?
Yeah. So two things about shelters. So, sorry. Relative to shelters, we list in the hazard mitigation plan where the shelters are. We list, based on the information we received from the committee and the emergency management director, any sheltering needs that might be able to be addressed in the action plan. We also note whether there's an active emergency operations plan, a SEMP, community emergency operations plan, emergency response plan, what plans you have. So this is part of our capabilities assessment. The mitigation plan itself isn't going to do that, but it's an opportunity to identify the strengths and weaknesses in that emergency management framework and ecosystem in the town. So those could come out as mitigation actions in the overall strategy to say, We recognize that our SEMP hasn't been really looked at in several years, or we recognize that the existing, I've heard this from emergency managers, our shelter, which is our designated shelters at the old middle school or whatever, we don't have enough beds for more than 12 people. Or we don't have a separate cooking facility. So there are needs like that, and those can end up in this plan. I've sort of moved away from the emergency management field a bit in my career, but I've done recovery planning, and I've done some pre-disaster. Early in my career, I was more in the disaster services space, and so I was more closely related to that, but it carries through the mitigation planning in that way that you can't talk about mitigation without talking about preparedness and recovery. So that's the first question. The second question, I just had it. Economy, thank you. So one of the reasons we're heavy on infrastructure and town buildings is because we have easy access to talking with the folks that are running those facilities. I mentioned earlier, FEMA is requiring that these plans show how we communicate with the business community. I can't understand why it's harder to have this conversation with business owners, because it's so important. But the answer is very similar to the answer about the emergency management. It's that we evaluate, to the best of our knowledge and the best information that we have, how these hazards may impact the economy. And it's a qualitative assessment. But each of the hazards for the profiles for the hazards that we're looking at in this plan is going to have a discussion about the impacts to the economy, the impacts to population, the impacts to the built environment. And the more information the more we can hear from the business community about the implications of the events that have already occurred. How did the flooding events from 2023, 24, how did that impact their business operation? What is currently putting a strain on their cash flow that has to do with whether it's severe weather or extreme heat? There's some businesses might say, yeah, well, actually we sell ice cream and we are doing really well with these really hot summers. And others may say, well, farmers with drought. So there's a whole range of how these businesses can be impacted by natural hazards. And again, we're not doing an economic recovery plan or any sort of targeted economic procedure. That's not the word I'm looking for. We're not any more focused on the economy as a asset or feature at risk than we are about the others, but it is addressed. And the more information we can have, the better, because that way we can address it more directly and more specifically. We have reached out to the Chamber of Commerce. I know they've been on our emails. If there are, the hospital is an important business, but if there are other businesses that folks here, members of the committee, think that we should be connecting with directly, we'd love to make those connections. Mm.
So in an area like this, where there's a handful of people who own most of the retail structures, it really has to be addressed properly in the first places, in conjunction with how their decisions or non-decisions will affect businesses.
That's a great point. Thank you. I said I'd have you out of here before 6, and I am not holding true to that, but I do want to offer any other comments.
So there can be things that are in your, it sounds like when you say that's a great idea, like you can do that, blah, blah, blah. So there's that piece, so that can go in the plan, but then not everything that's included in the plan has a specific action item at this time, because those action items need to react.
Yeah, I think that's a fair description. Although if there's a risk and a vulnerability identified, you can really make an action for almost anything. It doesn't have to be a huge, sweeping, expensive thing. I mean, something as simple as increasing education about something can be a really valuable action. Educating certain, like, interdepartmental staff members about how to communicate can be an action. So, yeah, yes, and,
Yes, but.
right, exactly.
Two areas on this plan, I'm curious if these two areas are addressed specifically. I was the operations officer for the state police for a long time. I was assigned to EMA. I moved from more than that for disasters and stuff like this. There were two components that were critical to the success of the residents.
Mhm.
Some of these plans have them, some didn't. And I'm curious if you're going to put these in here. Continuity of operations plan, is that something you would put in here?
No, it's not part of this plan.
So that'd be separate?
Yep.
Okay. And so we won't get into the minutia of like the ESF functions,
No.
functions, none of that?
No.
That wouldn't be in here at all?
No, that would be, again, more, are COOPs normally in the SIMPs? The,
You know, I've done the groups, I just don't know if they're in this thing.
yeah, no, they're more, I've seen them more attached to the Community Emergency Management Plan, which is just, they're all under the bucket of emergency services. They're just different branches.
So there's not a link explicitly incident plan in this one?
No, really not as much as I would have expected. Every other type of disaster services product is very directly aligned with the incident management system. Mitigation planning, not so much. That's not to say, if we're talking about improving a community emergency management process or plan in here, we could provide a little bit of detail and specify something about incident management, or maybe there's some aspect of incident management and how it's conducted in South Kingstown that needs a little bit of work, and that could be a mitigation action. We're just not really going into a lot of detail on that in this plan. Yep.
Just one last quick comment. So we've been more aggressive on grants in the past couple of years, and we're actually moving to hire a grant person, special project person.
Great.
The traditional approach of putting a lot of projects in, part of that was to get them on the radar. We don't know what grants are coming.
Right.
They come all the time. Who knew COVID would happen? Money would fall from the sky, right? So if you don't have it planned, then to your point, you have to make those updates, quickly, and usually timing doesn't work that way.
Right.
So I guess my only recommendation, while you make that balance, there may be stuff out there we identify for a grant that may or may not come to fruition, but I hate to take too many things off the list, because you never know. Usually these things come up, and we have a meeting and say, all right, what on this list? Let's go to the resilience plan, let's go to hazard mitigation, let's find the project that fits, dovetails with that grant.
Yeah.
And so if we narrow that list too small, our budget gets too small.
Right. No, and I didn't mean to suggest that we should shorten the list to shorten the list for convenience. We take a fine-tooth comb. And really the most important thing is that we are evaluating what actions have made some progress, what actions haven't, and why, and what can we do if they are still relevant and important. How do we rephrase them, or at least discuss the lack of progress in a way that shows just because nothing has happened, it doesn't mean that this is any less important to happen when we have the resources available to us. As long as there is a link to the risk assessment in the plan, I'm comfortable putting anything as a mitigation action. I like to be straightforward and concise. That's just the way that I roll as a planner. I'm never going to tell a town, this is just too many actions, so we have to start slashing. But it is my job to make this a readable document and a usable document, so I will, I'll push back if I think that there's redundancy or something in there that isn't linked to something else in the plan. Anything else? Well, this has been fantastic. I really, really appreciate everyone's input. We will continue to be moving this along. Committee members will hear from us soon to schedule our next committee meetings. And we'll put the pencil to the page on probably getting started on the action review as well as the capability assessment very soon. Yes, thank you all. Have a great night.
And just before everybody, when we did have a sign-in list, so if you can make sure your name and email's on the list, so that we send information out, and people, if we didn't send it to, we may be able to,
Oh, thank you. Fantastic.
Yeah, sign me up.
Thank you so much.
For the committee.
Oh, absolutely. I'll have Jamie put you on the list. That'd be great. Thank you. Hey.
Making the list concise, which I totally understand, because, list formalities is infrastructure of governmental bullshit that we do. Is there any reason why they can't be random, like a small wish list that
Oh.
the committee has, where all of us are like, let's keep an eye on this, because that could have been us.
I mean,
Are they able to do that, even if it doesn't go through you?
yeah.
Can a committee do something like that? Can it be recommended?
I would just put it in the plan, and maybe they become low priority actions because there's no path to implementation right now or something like that. But I mean, if they're worthy of being in there, put them in.
Yeah. Because I know some of them can be up here, but I always look around, but you know what? That tree might fall. We should keep an eye on it.
Yeah. So something like that, for instance, I would try to put that in a big